Chapter 27. "Shit," Ripley said. "I should have known. She told me she was going to do this." Tully and Moto continued to strip wires in the dimly lit control room. "Nothing we can do about it now," Wilks said. An icy hand had gripped his heart. He felt as frustrated as Ripley, and sick with fear for the young woman. He had known Billie longer, had known how the casts of the lost family had eaten at her. If anyone was responsible, he was. If you had been thinking, you could have stopped her. Then it was Billie's voice he heard. "Fuck off, Wilks. Who do you think you are?" Wilks gritted his teeth. There wasn't anything he could do. Just hope that Billie was going to come back. If anything happened to her, he'd... What? Nothing. Ripley said, "You're right. I just wish..." She trailed off and absently picked up her spot welder. "Hey, everyone there?" McQuaid's voice crackled from the set. "I've got movement here, coming from the west." Wilks unslung his rifle and started to the exit. "Fork," he said as he ran. "Nothing yet." "Can't get a number," said McQuaid. "They're moving in a group, 5 or 6. Wilks reached the sliding door. Fork crouched in the small anteroom, shielded by the thick, melted gate, weapon pointed out. "They've stopped outside the compound," McQuaid said. "Looks like... Wait, somebody's coming." Wilks and Fork stood together and waited. "Everyone stay put," Wilks said. A lone figure stumbled into view, halfway between the Kurtz and Arona's hill. A woman, unarmed. Her clothes were in rags, exposing one dirty breast. Her face was a mask of fear. "Hello?" she called out, voice quaking. "Is anyone here?" She pushed stringy, matted hair out of her eyes and looked around nervously. "I'm safe. We've been waiting for a ship to come." She turned and held outstretched arms towards the Kurtz, palms up. "Please!" "Wilks," Fork whispered. He lowered his rifle slightly. "I dunno." He looked at the woman. Yelled, "Bring the others out into the open." She spun at the sound of his voice, but kept her arms up. Her face twisted, and she began to sob. "Yes," she said. Of course." 2 men and another woman walked into view, as tattered and grubby as the first person. They all looked frightened and unsure of themselves. None of them were armed. "McQuaid, is that it?" Wilks asked. A pause. "Can't tell. Nothing else is moving." The 4 stood in the open. They swayed slightly, as if holding themselves up was an effort. "You catching this, Ripley?" said Wilks. "Yeah." She sounded worried. "I don't like it. Could be trouble." "We've got 'em covered," said Fork. "What say I step outside and see? If they've got friends in the bushes, they won't fire on their own people." Wilks tightened his jaw. "They might." "We could stay in here and talk about it all day," Fork said. "But eventually we're gonna have to go back to the ship. Gotta do something with them." Wilks nodded. He didn't like it either, but Fork was right. "Stay low and give me a clear sight," he said. Fork raised his voice. "Okay, I'm coming out now. We have loaded weapons, so don't move." The first woman continued to sob, the only noise in the still air. Falk climbed through the gate, carbine trained on the ragged group. He moved towards them slowly and carefully. Wilks put one leg through the gate and straddled it. He pointed his rifle at the clump of trees on the west. The four people suddenly hit the ground as one. The quiet shattered as gunfire cracked across the compound. Billie looked at the computer readings as the flyer sped towards the state that had been Northern California, but she didn't touch anything. It all seemed fine. She would be at the coordinates in a little under 2 hours, provided nothing went wrong. What could go wrong? I'm a top-notch pilot, and Amy and her family will be standing by, waiting to jump aboard when I show up. Plus, I have lots of time. She smiled at herself. She had apparently gone insane at some point, and hadn't noticed until now. When she had committed herself to saving the child back on Gateway, she'd never thought she'd be doing it this way, alone in a stolen ship. She couldn't remember what she had thought. That it would be easy, maybe? That somebody else would do it for me. If she had learned anything from knowing Ripley, it was that to make something happen, you had to make it happen. Silly and redundant, but very true. She couldn't just sit and hope that things would change by themselves. Not anymore. The little girl's name was Amy, but it was also Billie. They would make it together, or not at all. Shit! Wilks hit the ground. He didn't see the shooters, but he capped off a short burst into the trees at chest level. The hillside provided partial protection. He didn't dare move. McQuaid shouted in his ear, most of it lost in the noise. "Fucking 2 gunners! Due—" The metal gate clanged as bullets drilled into it. Wilks fired again and spared a glance at Falk. He was down. Hit, or had he purposely dropped? No way to know. The 4 fanatics remained still, but one of the men began to shout. "Don't kill them! We need them! She demands them!" The other 3 began to screech for salvation, calling loudly on the Great Mother. Oh man, they were pinned down. They had to do something to break this up. Another barrage of fire chinged into the gate. Wilks got an idea. He screamed and lay still, pretending to be wounded. "Don't move, Falk. If you're alive, don't move." Seconds ticked by. Wilks stared into the bushes and waited. Sweat trickled down his neck as the sun suddenly seemed to get much hotter. He heard quiet movement behind him, from inside the gate, and he hoped that Ripley had the sense to stay put. The 4 fanatics continued to pray in high, shaky voices. Wilks heard twigs crackle and snap ahead of him. A dark shape moved through the woods. "Not yet!" A voice tried to hiss from several meters farther into the trees. "Wait!" 2 gunners. Wilks aimed at the shape in front and fired a double tap. The figure fell back into the shadows with a yelp. Wilks retrained his rifle at the voice and squeezed the trigger again. The unseen sniper cried out in pain. At the sounds of the shots, the people lying next to Falk jumped up and ran towards Wilks. One of them tripped over Falk's body and smacked into the dirt. Falk rolled over, sat up, and cracked the man's skull with the butt of his rifle. "Way to go, Falk." Wilks fired twice more. Both of the women crumpled. The last man stumbled onward, eyes crazed. He got close enough so that gore spattered Wilks as his final shot caught the runner in the chest, The man fell, coughed blood, and died. "Hold it!" Wilks shouted. Nothing moved. If the gunners were still alive, there was no sign. He came up slowly, rifle still aimed into the trees. "Falk, you hit!" he said into the comm. The big man had lain back down. "Yeah, not too bad, I don't think." His voice shook. "Ripley? Right here. Did you get them?" She didn't sound too steady either. "Pretty sure." He wiped at the bits of tissue and blood on his skin. "That, or I just shot a couple of innocent bystanders. Let me check. Hang in there, Falk. I'm not going anywhere." Wilks pulled into a crouch and ran low for the trees, weapon ready. If anybody moved, he or she was going to get pasted. One of the shooters was dead, a middle-aged man with a shaved head. He'd been shot in the throat. The other was still alive, a few meters away, a small woman with a bad stomach wound. The bullets had ripped her guts to shreds. Amazingly, she was still conscious. She lay on her back and pushed at the dirt with her bare feet, trying to crawl away from the compound. She opened her eyes as Wilks approached, her face contorted with pain and rage, her abdomen a slick red tangle of exposed intestine. "You'll die," she managed. "You'll..." She closed her eyes, exhausted. It was cool in the shade of the trees. A light breeze stalled the sweat on Wilks's brow as he aimed carefully. "Yeah," he said. The shot echoed for a long time. Tully worked at her portable console while Ripley continued to hook the system back together in the dim light. The original detonator was set up on a sequential timer, too complicated to fix easily, so Tully worked on a chain-link relay. The hardwiring had to be clean. It had to last for a while. Falk was okay. He had 2 wounds, a minor one high in the left shoulder and a slightly more serious one through the meat of his bicep. Jones had already patched him up and filled him with painkillers. Ripley worked as quickly as she could, aware that this first trouble wouldn't be their last, if they didn't hurry. "Ready," Tully said. "We still have to tune Arona's dish to where we're going to be when we reach a safe distance, but the program is set. In theory, we call the computer here and the clock starts running when we send the signal." Ripley looked at the small console and nodded. "Go try it," she said. "We don't want to count on theory." "Right, I'll type in a command and send it. If the word shows on the screen, we have a clean signal. Go." Tully grabbed a light and disappeared into the dark corridor. Ripley stared at the jumble of wires and sighed. She didn't want to think about it, no time, but... She had fired on the people who had run towards the gate, meaning she wasn't First Lord, a mandatory feature in synthetics. It was almost enough to make her believe that somehow it wasn't true, that Jones had misread the tests. Except she had never taken any kind of electronics course in her life, and she knew exactly what went where. The knowledge was just there, like how to walk or speak. She wondered what else she knew. "Ripley!" It was Tully, her voice barely audible. "Do it," she said into the set. She turned towards the portable and watched. A series of numbers ran across the screen and disappeared. A second passed, and the word "boom" appeared in the upper left corner in glowing green letters. Ripley nodded. "It works." Static intertwined with Tully's laughter, making Ripley suddenly feel very far away from everything, from humanity. She got back to work. Only a few minutes until landing. Billie watched the computer screen nervously and checked the action on her carbine for the 100th time. The ship began a gradual descent through the outskirts of an industrial town. She had flown over several small cities, had watched for signs of life all along the way. She'd seen plenty. Hundreds, thousands of aliens had run beneath her, headed north. There had been no people. Billie hoped that the others were doing well. She also hoped she wasn't about to crash. She rested her hands on the steering and pulled left a hair. The ship pulled left. She pushed forward and the ship nosed downwards a bit. Okay, got it. The monitor blinked that the desired coordinates had been reached. If Amy's father had given out the wrong numbers in that last transmission, she was screwed. The flyer's landing engines kicked on and it began to lower straight down. Billie maneuvered the ship over a strip of road. Rubble flew in the wake of the ship as it settled onto the pavement. Billie unbuckled her safety straps and switched the engines off, amazed that it had been so easy. There was no movement outside the flyer. She patted the extra magazines and set of flare sticks in her hip pouch as she walked to the hatch and tried to ignore the fear. That the flying had been so simple somehow made it worse, like she had used up all her luck. Amy is the thing, she told herself firmly. Amy and her father and Mordecai and whoever else has become part of the girl's family. She stepped out of the flyer, weapon raised, and immediately recoiled from the smell. The stench of burnt plastic and rot was overwhelming. Maybe it was like that in all of the cities now. But the debris wasn't too bad, at least. Apparently there were still a few places that hadn't been destroyed completely by riots or infestation. She walked around the ship. There was no sound, no motion. It was as if she was the only living being in an empty world. The buildings around her were all a uniform beige and silent. Where to start? She walked towards the structure to her right and read the lettering set above the smashed doorframe. Endotech Micro. That sure sounded like a microchip company, and that's what the transmission had said, right? This had to be the place. Unfortunately, the same lettering was on the building across the street. It was an entire complex, not one factory. Damn. The silence was unnerving. Billie stepped through the doorframe. Her boots crunched on bits of shattered plexi material as she looked up and down the entryway. Halls led off into the blackness in either direction. Maybe she could find a control room of some kind with a working intercom system, or a speaker that she could hook up to the flyer. Brilliant. Except what the fuck do you know about wiring something like that up? If she could fly a ship, she could figure it out. She sure as hell didn't have time to search each building. Billie pulled a flare stick from her pocket and snapped it. The tip sizzled red, a dim light at best, but it would have to do. If there had been a portable light on board the flyer, she hadn't seen it. She kicked herself for not thinking of it back at the compound as she stared into the pitch hallway, but there was nothing to be done about it now. She started down the corridor to her left. Her footsteps echoed loudly and hollowly in the cool, dead air. If anyone was in the building, she wasn't going to be a surprise to them. Within seconds, the light from the outside had disappeared completely. The glow from the flare only illuminated the space a meter or two ahead. She walked close to one wall, held the light up to make out the words on the doors she passed. Mostly names of employees, it seemed. The hallway seemed to go on forever. She struggled to damp down a feeling of dread that threatened to rise up and bloom into panic. The stale air was clammy against her skin. She didn't know where she was headed. Anything could be waiting for her, watching her. And it was dark. That was the worst. It was blacker than space. She stopped. This was completely stupid. She would go back outside and reevaluate the situation. She was going to lose it in here. Suddenly, she heard a noise directly behind her. Snick. She froze. Just a little sound, could be anything, a shift of weight or the sound of a door opening. Billie threw the flare stick to the ground and stepped on it. It dimmed, but it didn't go out entirely. The flickering glow made the shadows dance wildly. She gritted her teeth against a scream, her eyes wide and useless in the dark. She turned slowly, as quietly as she could, her brain yammering 1,000 things at once. Human, not a drone. Fanatic, maybe. Do I talk or wait? Are they armed? Oh, shit. Oh, Amy. She pointed the carbine ahead of her and tried to think clearly, until a pair of rough hands brushed against her face.